And so we come into chapter 4, and we see both clearly and repeatedly that call to learn from our experiences, both individually, but also corporately. Again and again, from verse 1 through to verse 41, we see Moses say, "You have seen," or more accurately, "You have heard God, and you've placed, and you have placed, and he has placed upon you his love and his requirements. Therefore, hold fast, be obedient. Do not seek to water down or omit or add anything to God's requirements. Be careful, thoughtful, mindful. Remember, don't forget. Don't try to replace the unseen creator with a visible creation of your own. Don't be tempted by others," and so on and so on. Why? Because God has called you, firstly, to be his own, and secondly, to be his witnesses. And we see in the midst of this chapter 4 how Moses pens, "The other nations will see the Israelites and they will say." And here we face again that paradox. Israel was called to completely destroy Og and Shihon, the two kings east of the Jordan. We've seen that already. And yet now they're called to be witnesses, called first to be committed, but called to be witnesses. And we think, how do we hold those two together? But we also in this chapter glimpse something of God's grace in verses 25 to 31. And we see it's not so much if, but when you fail, when you fall, when you're tempted away, if you are willing to admit, to humble yourselves, then God will call you, draw you, welcome you back. But if you will not, and I guess in some ways we'll see that through the rest of the book, but we've really got to wait until chapter 28 to find out the final detail as we see the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience. Yet what we see is God can, and I suppose this is something for us to think about, what we see in this is God can only love us to the extent that we are willing to allow him. Now, he loves us fully and completely, but we can only experience that to the extent that we're willing to allow that. And so here in this chapter, long chapter, as Moses addresses this second generation, we see two key things: observance of the law. And we need to remember that this isn't a call to sort of blind legalistic adherence. This was a call to the community to live mindfully of God and of one another. And we'll see as we go through Deuteronomy how those laws open out that. And we have to remember that God's law, and we see that in the likes of Proverbs and so on, God's law was seen as wisdom and righteousness. So the call is to live within God's wisdom and God's righteousness, and not to replace it with a wisdom and a righteousness of our own. And then the second thing we see, as well as observance to the law, is Moses reminds them of the dangers of idolatry, the subtlety, the deceptive promise of temptation. And the situation that Moses refers to in chapter 4 here is the one that goes back to Numbers chapter 25, the Baal of Peor, the god of this other group of people, where we see attraction led to indulgence, which led to worship, and to worship that was not that which was not of God. And we know that something of that for ourselves. How often have we said, just once, it'll be okay. I'll do it in private. No one will know. But God knows. And verses 39 to 40, in a sense, we could have just read those sort of two verses because they sum up all of this chapter. Acknowledge God, which means so much more than that sort of simple acknowledgement, oh yes, and then just to carry on as we were. But acknowledging God meant shaping and molding our lives to fit God's requirements. So the summing up is acknowledge God and keep his commands. And as we read or sort of read through the chapter, how many of those echoes from our reading of the New Testament did we see? Revelation, Paul, the Gospels, how the law seeped into the early church and challenged and shaped them. And then Moses finishes with that reminder to establish what were called cities of refuge, that call to exercise mercy, compassion, and forgiveness to one another as God is merciful, compassionate, and forgiving to them. So I'll stop there, and that gives us some time just to sort of have a think about and